Alara Quinn's serving tray trembled as every conversation in the Royal Orient Ballroom died mid-sentence. The entire hall had frozen except for one sound, the agonized screaming of a child. She turned toward the grand entrance where armored men now stood like sentinels, and her breath caught. The man at the center held a small boy whose cries seemed to crack the very air, making the crystal chandeliers shudder above. He wasn't just handsome, he was otherworldly, with silver hair cascading over black armor and eyes that burned crimson in the candlelight. Their gazes locked across the sea of terrified nobles. His eyes held exhaustion, desperation, and something ancient that made her soul recognize danger even as her heart recognized pain. Before her manager could grab her arm, Alara's feet were already carrying her forward. She didn't know the pale figure was Alistair Varen, the vampire king whose name was whispered in every dark corner of the realm. She only knew one truth: no child should suffer like that. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now, let us begin. The wine stain on Alara's white serving blouse had set permanently weeks ago. She'd tried bleach, vinegar, even that expensive stain remover her grandmother swore by, but nothing worked. Now she stood in the cramped staff bathroom of the Royal Orient Ballroom, pulling her dark blonde hair into a bun so tight it made her temples throb, trying to look professional for another endless shift. Her reflection told a story she worked so hard to hide. 23 years old with shadows carved beneath her hazel eyes from double shifts at the diner and late nights caring for her grandmother. The cheap concealer couldn't mask the exhaustion anymore. Alara, table 12 needs their champagne refilled. Madame Rosette, the head server, snapped her fingers impatiently from the doorway. Alara grabbed her tray and swept into the ballroom's glittering expanse. The venue lived up to its name. Walls adorned with gold leaf, chandeliers dripping with crystals that cost more than her yearly rent, silk curtains framing floor-to-ceiling windows. Nobility and wealth moved through space like they owned the very air. She didn't belong here. Every shift reminded her of that truth. The evening had been demanding since sunset. Diplomats, merchant lords, ladies draped in jewels that could feed her neighborhood for months. Alara navigated between tables with practiced grace, smiling politely while her feet screamed in her too small shoes and her stomach reminded her she'd skipped lunch again. At precisely 9:45, everything shattered. The ballroom's ornate double doors exploded open, and silence rippled through the crowd like a wave of ice water. Alara looked up from pouring water and felt her lungs forget how to work. 3 men entered first, warriors clad in black armor etched with silver runes, their eyes scanning the room with predatory precision. Corvindrel, Maro Vesk, and Luther Graham, though she wouldn't learn their names until later. They moved like violence barely restrained, hands resting on sword hilts. Then he walked through. Alara had never seen someone command reality itself just by existing. He stood well over 6 feet tall, dressed in black ceremonial armor that seemed to drink in the candlelight. Silver hair fell past his shoulders like liquid moonlight, and an obsidian crown sat upon his head, its dark metal twisted into sharp, elegant points. But it was his eyes that stole her breath, crimson as fresh blood, ancient as stone, and currently burning with barely controlled desperation. A small child clung to his neck, face buried against the armored shoulder, body shaking with violent sobs. Vampire. Alara heard Madame Rosette whisper beside her, the word dripping with terror. That's Alistair Varen, the vampire king himself. Alara didn't recognize the name, but she understood fear. Every server had pressed themselves against the walls. Even the ballroom owner, Lord Vespian, had appeared from his private office, wringing his hands like a nervous merchant. Who is he? Alara whispered. Madame Rosette stared at her as if she'd asked why the sky was blue. Stay away from that group. Do not approach.
Do not speak.
Do not even look too long. Do you understand me? But Alara was already watching the child. The boy couldn't have been more than 3 years old, dressed in miniature formal attire, a tiny black coat with silver buttons. As his father tried to lower him into a chair at the center table, the child's whimpers erupted into full-throated wails that made guests flinch. Shalucian, the vampire king's voice was deep, commanding even through obvious desperation. Papa needs you to be brave, little one. The boy's cries only intensified, raw and primal, the sound of something fundamentally broken. Alara's heart twisted violently in her chest. She knew that sound. She'd heard it from children at the orphanage where she sometimes volunteered. Grief. Abandonment. The kind of crying that came from a wound no medicine could heal. Alistair Varon tried everything. He offered a golden toy horse from his coat pocket, promised sweets, ran his fingers gently through the boy's dark hair, switched between their language and what sounded like ancient vampiric tongue. Nothing worked. The child screamed as though his very soul was tearing apart. The other guests shifted uncomfortably. Some covered their ears. Several nobles began signaling for their carriages, eager to escape. Alara watched the most powerful creature in the realm crumble. He held his son close, whispering desperately in the boy's ear, his broad armored shoulders curving inward as if trying to shield the child from a world that had already wounded him too deeply. The armored attendants stood rigid, their expressions carefully blank, but she could see the exhaustion in their eyes. They'd been fighting this losing battle for a long time. She'd taken 3 steps toward them before her conscious mind caught up with her body. Alara, Madame Rosette hissed, grabbing at her sleeve. Stop. Right now. She didn't stop. The warriors moved instantly, forming a wall of armor and muscle. Corvin Drell placed a firm but controlled hand on her shoulder. Miss, step back. Immediately. I just want to help, Alara said quietly, her eyes locked on the crying child. The Vampire King's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Let her through. The warriors parted. Alara approached slowly, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Up close, Alistair Varon was overwhelming, the sharp, inhuman beauty of his features, the scent of night-blooming flowers and something darker, ancient power radiating from him like cold fire. But she focused on the child. Hi there, she said softly, lowering herself to crouch at eye level with the boy. My name is Alara. The child's sob stuttered. He peeked at her from his father's armored shoulder, his little face red and streaked with tears, his crimson eyes, so like his father's, swimming with unspeakable sadness. That's a lot of big feelings for such a little person, Alara continued gently, her voice the same one she used with frightened animals and scared children. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to cry. Please, Alistair Varon said, and the raw desperation in that single word cracked something open in her chest. She slowly extended her hand toward the child's tear-stained cheek. The moment Alara's fingertips brushed the child's cheek, the world held its breath. The screaming stopped, not gradually, not with the usual hiccuping transitions of a calming child. The boy simply quieted. His tiny body went still against his father's armor, and his red-rimmed eyes fixed on Alara with an intensity that seemed far too ancient for someone so small. Saints preserve us. Maro Vesk breathed from behind her, his scarred hand falling away from his sword hilt. The prince. He stopped, Luther Graham whispered, disbelief cracking through his military composure. He actually stopped. Corvin Drell stepped closer, his weathered face displaying something Alara suspected rarely appeared there. Hope. Your Majesty, the boy is silent. Alistair Varon finished, his crimson eyes locked on Alara with such fierce concentration she felt pinned in place. For the first time in 4 months, he is silent. The child reached for her with both small hands, making a soft sound that wasn't quite words, but held all the desperation of a plea. Without thinking, Alara gathered him into her arms. He was lighter than she expected, his little body trembling as he pressed his face against her shoulder and released a shuddering sigh that sounded like relief. S-H-H-H, Alara hummed softly, swaying slightly the way her grandmother had once rocked her. You're all right now, sweetheart. I've got you. The boy's fingers clutched her uniform blouse with surprising strength, as if he feared she might vanish if he let go. His breathing gradually steadied, evening out into something almost peaceful. The vampire king rose to his full height, towering over her. Up close, the evidence of his suffering was undeniable. Shadows carved beneath those otherworldly eyes, a tightness around his perfect mouth, the barely perceptible tremor in his hands before he locked them behind his back. "What did you do?" His voice was urgent, almost demanding, but lacking any cruelty. "Tell me exactly what you did." Alara blinked up at him, suddenly aware that she was holding the child of the most dangerous being in the realm while surrounded by his armed guard in a ballroom full of witnesses. Nothing. I just—" "You did something," Alistair interrupted, taking a step closer. The temperature seemed to drop. "Healers, mages, night nurses trained in ancient arts, dozens of them, have tried everything. Yet you, a waitress," Alara finished quietly, her cheeks burning. "I'm just a waitress, Your Majesty. I didn't even know who you were until—" "Alara." Madame Rosette's shrill voice cut through the moment. She bustled forward, wringing her hands, her face pale with terror. "Your Majesty, please forgive this girl's impertinence. She will be dismissed immediately. If she has offended—" Alistair Varen's gaze shifted to the manager, and Alara watched the woman freeze mid-sentence, as if she'd been turned to stone. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The look alone communicated absolute authority. Madame Rosette stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet in her haste to retreat. The Vampire King's attention returned to Alara, and something in his expression softened, just barely, like ice beginning to thaw at the edges. "How long has it been since he slept, Corbin?" 72 hours, Your Majesty," the grizzled warrior replied quietly. "Before that, 20 minutes here and there. Never more than half an hour at a time. Not since." He didn't finish, but the weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air. "Since his mother died," Alistair said flatly, the words carved from stone. He looked at his son, now peacefully nestled in Alara's arms, and something cracked in his carefully maintained mask. "For months. My son has known no peace for 4 months." Alara's heart twisted. The child in her arms had relaxed completely, his breathing deep and even. One tiny hand still gripped her blouse, but the desperate clutching had eased into something gentler. "Your Majesty," Morrow spoke up hesitantly, "the council is expecting your return before midnight. The border negotiations—" "Can wait," Alistair said, never taking his eyes off his son. "But the words—" Luther began. "I said they can wait." The king's voice held an edge of something dangerous now. Then, quieter, almost to himself, "For months I've held him while he screamed. For months of watching him suffer and being powerless to stop it." Alara shifted the boy's weight carefully, noting how he sighed contentedly at the movement. "He's exhausted," she said softly. "He probably just needed—" "What?" Alistair's gaze snapped to hers. "What did he need that I couldn't give him? That trained specialists couldn't provide? What do you possess that we lack?" The raw desperation in his voice made her throat tighten. This wasn't a king speaking. This was a terrified father at the end of his rope. Before she could answer, the child made a small protesting sound, his grip tightening on her blouse. His eyes cracked open, locking on his father with sudden anxiety. The whimpering started again, quiet but building. No, it's okay," Alara murmured, adjusting her hold. The boy calmed immediately, burrowing back against her shoulder. The 3 attendants exchanged meaningful glances. Corvin cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, we should return to the Eclipse Dominion. The prince needs proper rest and secure." "He won't let her go," Alistair said, and for the first time, Alara heard something like helplessness in his voice. "Look at him." It was true. The child's fingers were knotted in her uniform, his small body molded to hers with the complete trust of someone who'd finally found safety after months of terror. The Vampire King was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were fighting some internal battle. Finally, he spoke, his words careful and deliberate. "Miss Quinn," Alara supplied. "Alara Quinn." "Miss Quinn." He took a breath, and when he continued, she realized with shock that he was asking, not commanding. "My son has not slept soundly since his mother's death. His suffering has been—" His voice caught. Unbearable. And in 5 minutes, you've given him more peace than I've managed in 4 months. Alara waited, sensing where this was going and feeling her pulse begin to race. Come with us, Alistair said quietly. Just for tonight. Until he sleeps. Until I understand what you did that finally reached him. Your Majesty, Alara breathed. I can't just. I'm not ordering you, he interrupted. I'm asking. As a father, not a king. She looked down at the child in her arms, at his peaceful face finally free from anguish, at the way he clung to her like she was his anchor in a storm. Then she looked back at Alistair Varen and saw past the crown, past the power, past the supernatural beauty. She saw a man breaking under the weight of helplessness and grief. Just for tonight? She asked softly. Just for tonight, he confirmed, though something in his eyes suggested he already knew that was a lie they both wanted to believe. Alara thought of her grandmother waiting at home, of her morning shift at the diner, of every logical reason she should refuse. Then she felt the child's heartbeat against her chest, small and steady and finally calm. Okay, she whispered. I'll come. The carriage was nothing like Alara had expected. From the outside, it appeared to be carved from black obsidian, its surface catching moonlight like dark water. But inside, shadows moved with unnatural fluidity across velvet seats, and the air itself seemed to hum with ancient magic. Alara sat across from Alistair, the prince still sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Corvin drove and Morrow and Luther rode alongside on horses that looked too perfect to be entirely mortal. The wards recognized royal blood, Alistair explained quietly, noticing her wide-eyed stare at the shifting darkness. They'll protect the carriage from any threat. You're safe. Safe. The word felt absurd. She was traveling through the night with the vampire king to his fortress, with his son in her arms. Nothing about this was safe. The prince stirred, and Alara automatically began humming again, something her grandmother used to sing, a melody without words. The boy settled immediately, his small fingers flexing against her collar. Alistair watched this, with an expression she couldn't read. Hunger, perhaps. Or longing. Or maybe just bone-deep exhaustion. How far is the palace? She asked, needing to break the weighted silence. Not far. We crossed into Dominion territory the moment we left the ballroom district. He gestured toward the window. Look. Alara turned, and her breath caught. Rising from the landscape like a dark crown against the star-scattered sky stood the eclipsed Dominion, an obsidian fortress so massive it seemed to swallow the horizon. Towers spiraled upward into the night, their peaks sharp as blades. The entire structure gleamed with the same dark radiance as the carriage, and she could see lights flickering in countless windows like crimson eyes watching their approach. She started. Terrifying? Alistair supplied a hint of something bitter in his tone. Most humans think so. Beautiful. Alara finished softly. In a dangerous way. His crimson gaze sharpened on her face, studying her as if seeing something unexpected. Before he could respond, the carriage rolled through gates that opened without any visible hand touching them. They entered a courtyard paved in dark stone, lit by floating orbs that cast everything in shades of silver and shadow. Immediately, palace staff emerged from archways, some in formal attire, others in what looked like military dress, all of them moving with the preternatural grace of vampires. The carriage door opened, and Alara stepped out carefully, protecting the sleeping prince. The moment her feet touched the ground, conversation died. Dozens of eyes fixed on her. On the human woman holding their prince. What is the meaning of this? A woman in elaborate midnight blue robes swept forward, her silver hair pinned with jeweled combs. Your Majesty, why is a human carrying the air? Lady Seraphine, Alistair said calmly, emerging from the carriage. Miss Quinn is a guest. A guest? The woman's voice rose an octave. A human waitress touching the prince? This is enough. The single word from Alistair carried enough cold authority to freeze the courtyard into silence. But Alara could hear the whispers starting, hissed conversations in vampiric tongue, words she didn't understand, but whose tone was unmistakable. Threat.
Spy.
Distraction. Human filth. She shifted the prince carefully, trying to ignore the hostile stares boring into her from every direction. The boy made a small sound of discontent, his eyes flickering open briefly before closing again, still trusting her completely. "Perhaps I should," Elara began, moving to hand the child to one of the servants. The prince's eyes snapped open. His face crumpled, and a wail built in his throat. "No, no, shhhh. Elara quickly pulled him back against her shoulder, resuming her gentle swaying. "I'm here. It's okay." The crying stopped as abruptly as it had started. The courtyard fell into stunned silence again, but this time the quality was different.
Shocked.
Some faces showed wonder. Others showed fear. The prince, a young vampire in the servant's livery, breathed. "He won't release her." "Unnatural," someone else muttered. "My king," a man in formal military regalia stepped forward, his face severe. "Surely you cannot mean to allow a human into the royal wing. The security risks alone." "Commander Valen," Alistair interrupted, his voice like silk over steel. "Miss Quinn will be housed in the chambers adjacent to the prince's nursery. Post guards if it eases your concerns, but she stays." "Your Majesty," Lady Seraphine protested, "the council must be consulted. This breach of protocol is necessary." Alistair's eyes flashed dangerously. "My son hasn't slept in 4 months. Look at him now. Look at him and tell me you would deny him this peace." The advisors looked. The prince lay peacefully in Alara's arms, breathing deeply, one small hand clutched in her blouse, his face serene in a way none of them had seen since before his mother's death. No one spoke. "I thought not," Alistair said quietly. "Corvin, escort Miss Quinn to the West Tower. Morrow, Luther, ensure no one disturbs her chambers tonight." As Alara followed Corvin through corridors that seemed carved from night itself, she caught fragments of conversation from the staff they passed. The queen barely cold in her tomb. Exactly 4 months since the birth. They say she died before she could even hold him. Cursed, the whole bloodline cursed. Alara's arms tightened protectively around the prince. She wanted to ask questions, to understand what had happened, but Corvin's grim expression discouraged conversation. They climbed a spiral staircase that seemed to go on forever before emerging into a corridor lined with doors of dark wood inlaid with silver. Corvin stopped before one, pushing it open to reveal a chamber that was both austere and luxurious, a massive 4-poster bed with black silk curtains, furniture that looked centuries old, and windows overlooking the fortress grounds. "The prince's nursery is through there," Corvin gestured to a connecting door. "His Majesty's private chambers are on the other side. You'll have guards outside at all times." He paused. "For your protection as much as the prince's." "They think I'm dangerous," Alara said quietly. "They think change is dangerous," Corvin corrected. "And you, Miss Quinn, represent a change no one saw coming." He left, and Alara was alone with the sleeping child in a vampire fortress, surrounded by hostility and mystery. She moved to the nursery door, pushing it open to find a room decorated in deep blues and silvers, filled with expensive toys that looked barely touched. She settled into a rocking chair near the window, continuing her gentle rhythm. The prince sighed contentedly, burrowing deeper into her warmth. Alara didn't know how long she sat there, humming and rocking, watching the child's peaceful face and wondering what she'd gotten herself into. The moon had shifted position in the sky when she sensed she wasn't alone. She looked up. Alistair Varen stood in the doorway connecting to his chambers, still wearing his crown but somehow looking less like a king and more like a man carved from exhaustion and desperation. He said nothing, just watched them, his son sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, held by a human stranger who'd appeared in his life, like an answer to a prayer he'd been too proud to speak. Their eyes met across the darkened nursery. Something passed between them in that look. Not romantic, not yet, but profound. Recognition. Understanding. A connection neither of them had words for. Alara saw the grief in his face, the guilt, the love twisted up with terror. She saw a father who would give anything to save his son, even his kingdom's stability. And Alistair saw someone who'd stepped into danger without hesitation because a child was suffering. Someone who looked at his son and saw not a vampire prince, but simply a lonely little boy who needed comfort. He nodded once, a gesture that somehow communicated gratitude, respect, and a promise she couldn't yet understand. Then he was gone, leaving Alara alone with the weight of something she couldn't name settling over her heart like frost on glass. Dawn broke over the eclipsed dominion in shades of silver and violet, and Alara woke to find the prince still sleeping peacefully in her arms. She dozed in the rocking chair throughout the night, too afraid to move and disturb him. Her neck ached. Her legs had gone numb. She'd never felt more awake. The connecting door opened, and Morrow entered with military precision, stopping short when he saw them. His scarred face softened fractionally before the professional mask returned. "Miss Quinn," he said quietly. "His Majesty has ordered breakfast brought to your chambers." "The prince," he paused, staring at the sleeping child. "I've served the royal family for 40 years. I've never seen him sleep this long." "How long has it been?" Alara whispered. 7 hours. Morrow's voice held something like wonder. 7 continuous hours. The prince stirred at the sound, his crimson eyes blinking open. For a moment, Alara feared he'd start crying again, but instead, he simply looked at her, made a small, contented sound, and nestled closer. Over the following day, Alara watched. She watched as servants brought the prince his meals with perfect ceremony but no warmth, placing elaborate silver dishes before him, cutting his food into precise portions, then stepping back to observe from a respectful distance. No one smiled at him. No one spoke in soft, playful voices. She watched as Luther conducted what he called morning routine, dressing the boy in formal attire with efficient, gentle movements, but never once tickling his feet or making silly faces the way she'd seen parents do with children at the ballroom. She watched as a tutor arrived to read the prince's educational texts about vampire lineage and Dominion history in a monotone voice that would put anyone to sleep, let alone a 3-year-old child. "Does he play?" Alara asked Corvin, who'd been assigned to shadow her movements through the palace. Corvin looked puzzled. "Play, miss?"
"Games. Songs."
"Does anyone just play with him?" The warrior's expression grew uncomfortable. "The prince is heir to the eclipsed dominion. His schedule includes combat training foundations, language lessons, magical theory." "He's 3 years old," Alara interrupted softly. Corvin said nothing, but something in his eyes agreed with her. That afternoon, as the prince napped in her arms, he refused to sleep anywhere else. Alara gathered her courage. "Corvin, what happened to the queen?" The warrior's entire body went rigid. "Miss Quinn, please." She kept her voice gentle. "I need to understand. If I'm going to help him, I need to know." Corvin was silent for a long moment, his jaw working. Finally, "Her Majesty died 4 months ago. Childbirth complications. He stopped, cleared his throat. "She never held the prince. Died before she could." Alara's heart cracked. "And after?" "His Majesty forbade anyone from." Corvin struggled with the words. "He believed attachment would make the prince vulnerable."
"Weak."
"So we were instructed to care for the boy with respect and efficiency, but to maintain proper distance." "Distance," Alara repeated hollowly. She looked down at the sleeping child, at his small face finally free from anguish, and suddenly everything made terrible sense. When Alistair entered the nursery that evening, Alara was sitting on the floor with the prince, stacking wooden blocks and making exaggerated expressions of surprise when the boy knocked them over. The child's laughter, bright and clear and achingly rare, filled the room. The vampire king froze in the doorway, staring at his son, as if witnessing a miracle. "Your Majesty," Alara said softly, not stopping her play. "May I speak with you?" Alistair nodded, unable to tear his eyes from the laughing boy. Alara took a steady breath. "He's not sick. The healers have confirmed," Alistair began. "He's not cursed either." She finally looked up at him, holding his gaze. "Your Majesty, with respect, your son doesn't need a mage or a healer or ancient magic." "Then what?" "He just needs a mom." The silence that fell was absolute. Alistair went perfectly still, and Alara watched emotions war across his face: guilt, grief, and something sharp that looked like anger fighting against understanding. "You presume to tell me." His voice was dangerously quiet. "I presume nothing," Alara interrupted gently but firmly. "I'm telling you what I see. Your attendants are wonderful, respectful, careful, protective. But they treat him like a prince, not a child. They maintain distance. They don't hold him when he's scared, don't sing to him, don't play with him." She gestured to the boy, who was now attempting to stack blocks himself. "He's been starving for affection since the day he was born, and everyone's been so busy protecting him that no one thought to love him." "I love him," Alistair said, and the raw pain in his voice nearly broke her. "I would die for him." "I know." Alara's eyes softened. "But loving someone and letting them feel loved are different things." The Vampire King's carefully maintained control cracked. He turned away, one hand gripping the doorframe hard enough that the wood groaned. "His mother died bringing him into this world. Died because I couldn't protect her. Because my bloodline, my kingdom, demanded an heir." His voice dropped to something ragged. "I couldn't bear to if I let myself care too much, if I let others get close, and something happened. So you kept everyone at a distance." Alara finished quietly. "To protect him. And yourself." "Yes." The word came out broken. "But, Your Majesty." She stood slowly, still holding his gaze. "Distance didn't protect him from pain. It became the pain." Alistair's shoulders shook once, a tremor he couldn't quite control. When he finally looked at her, his crimson eyes shimmered with unshed tears, the first genuine vulnerability she'd seen from him beyond exhaustion. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. "I don't know how to be what he needs." "You don't have to fix it alone," Alara said. "Just let him in. Let yourself in." The prince, sensing the tension, made a small, distressed sound. Immediately, Alara moved to comfort him, but Alistair stepped forward first. "May I?" he asked softly. Alara nodded, watching as the Vampire King knelt and opened his arms. The boy hesitated only a moment before crawling into his father's embrace. Alistair held him close, not with distant respect, but with the fierce tenderness of a parent finally allowing himself to feel. "I'm sorry," he whispered into his son's dark hair, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, little one." The prince responded by wrapping his small arms around his father's neck and making a contented sound that Alara recognized as pure trust. Something fundamental shifted in that moment. She could see it in the way Alistair's rigid posture softened, in how he began unconsciously rocking the child the way she had, in the tear that finally escaped down his perfect face. Over the following days, the change deepened. The prince began seeking both of them, running to Alara when he wanted to play, to Alistair when he wanted stories. He learned their heartbeats, their voices, the particular comfort each offered. But not everyone celebrated this transformation. "The human has bewitched the air." Alara overheard Lady Seraphine hissing to Commander Valen in the corridor outside her chambers. "This unnatural attachment." Or perhaps, Valen replied coldly, "The air simply recognizes genuine care when he encounters it." "She's making His Majesty weak." Another advisor's voice joined in. "He spends hours in that nursery now. State matters pile up while he plays with blocks and reads children's stories. He's being a father." Corvin's gruff voice cut through. "Something this kingdom desperately needs him to be." "The cord is fracturing," Lady Seraphine insisted. "Half believe the girl is a blessing. The others believe she's destroying centuries of tradition. This cannot continue." That night, as Alara rocked the prince to sleep, he still preferred her for bedtime. She felt Alistair's presence in the doorway again. But this time, when their eyes met, she saw not just gratitude, but something warmer. Something that made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for seeing what I was too afraid to acknowledge." "Your Majesty." "Alistair," he corrected softly. "When we're here, with him, just Alistair." The intimacy of the moment settled between them like silk, delicate and profound. Alara nodded, not trusting her voice, acutely aware that something was beginning, something that went far beyond a prince's need for comfort. something that might change everything. The whispers began like poison seeping through cracks in stone. Alara first noticed them 3 days after her conversation with Alistair. The way servants fell silent when she passed, how nobles turned their backs in corridors, the susurrus, a vampiric tongue following her like a shadow. "They're saying you've replaced her," Morrow said bluntly one morning as he escorted her to breakfast. "The late queen." Alara nearly stumbled. "That's absurd. I'm just caring for the prince in ways no one else can," Morrow interrupted. "Spending hours in the king's presence, making him smile for the first time since her death."
He paused.
To many, that looks like a replacement. That afternoon, the royal council convened in the throne room. Alara wasn't present, but she heard about it from Corvin, whose expression had grown grimmer with each passing hour. "Lady Seraphine demanded your immediate dismissal," he told her quietly, checking the corridor before entering her chambers. "Said you're destabilizing the kingdom, that the court is fracturing over your presence." "And the king?" Alara asked, her heart hammering. "Refuse." Corvin's scarred face showed something like satisfaction. First time in months, he's asserted real authority. Told them the prince's well-being supersedes political convenience. Remind them he's still their king, and they'd do well to remember it. Alara should have felt relief. Instead, dread pooled in her stomach. "That will make things worse, won't it?" "Probably," Corvin admitted. But it needed saying. The first note appeared that night, slipped under her door while she slept. Alara found it at dawn, a piece of parchment with words written in elegant script. "Leave while you still can, human. Some fates are worse than death." Her hands trembled as she read it. She should tell someone. Should show Alistair or the guards. Instead, she tucked it into her drawer, not wanting to cause more trouble. The second note came 2 days later. "The queen's blood still stains these halls. Yours will join it if you remain." This time, she told Corvin. The warrior's face darkened dangerously. "We'll increase your guard detail. No one enters this wing without clearance." "I don't want to be a prisoner," Alara protested. "Better a protected prisoner than a dead guest," Corvin said grimly. But the threats continued. Whispered warnings from servants who claimed to be sympathetic, shadows that moved wrong in corridors, the sensation of being watched constantly. Once, she found her chamber door ajar when she'd locked it. Nothing was taken, but the message was clear. "We can reach you whenever we want." It was Corvin who finally told her the truth she'd been sensing but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. They stood on a balcony overlooking the fortress grounds, the prince playing with toy soldiers nearby under Luther's watchful eye. The setting sun painted everything in shades of blood and gold. "There's a prophecy," Corvin said without preamble. "Ancient. Predates even His Majesty's grandfather." Alara waited, her pulse quickening. "It states that the prince's mother, the woman who raises him, not necessarily the one who births him, will determine the fate of the vampire kind." Corvin's jaw tightened. "Some believe if she's kind, the prince will rule with mercy, potentially weakening vampire dominance. Others believe a strong mother will forge him into the greatest king we've ever known. And they think I'm..." Alara couldn't finish. "Becoming that woman." Corvin met her eyes. "The prince calls for you at night, runs to you when he's frightened. Alistair seeks your counsel on matters involving his son. To many, you're fulfilling the prophecy." "But I'm human," Alara whispered. "I'm temporary. I was only supposed to stay one night." "That was weeks ago," Corvin pointed out. "And you're still here. The prince still needs you." "The king..." He stopped, choosing his words carefully. "His Majesty is different with you here.
Stronger.
More present. Some see that as salvation. Others see it as weakness." "What do you see?" Alara asked. "I see a man remembering how to be human," Corvin said quietly. "And a kingdom that's forgotten why that matters." That night, Corvin found Alara in the library where she'd been reading to the prince. His expression made her blood run cold. "There's a rebel faction," he said without preamble. "The Crimson Veil. They've been underground for decades, but our intelligence suggests they're planning something. Soon." "Planning what?" Corvin's silence was answer enough. "They want to kill me," Alara said flatly. "Some believe killing you will reset the destiny. That if you die before the bond fully forms, they can install someone more suitable. Someone who will raise the prince to be ruthless. Alara felt ice spread through her veins. Does Alistair know? He knows. He's tripled security. Assigned Luther specifically to you, Luther never leaves his post, never sleeps. He's the most loyal warrior in the Dominion. Corvin hesitated. His Majesty is worried. More than I've seen him worry about anything except his son. Later, when Alara had finally gotten the prince to sleep and returned to her chambers, she found Alistair waiting in the sitting room. He stood by the window, backlit by moonlight, his silver hair gleaming, crown absent for once. You should have told me about the notes, he said quietly, not turning around. I didn't want to cause more problems, Alara. He finally turned, and the intensity in his crimson eyes stole her breath. Threats against your problems. Significant ones. Your Majesty. Alistair, he corrected, just as he had before. Please. She nodded, suddenly aware of how intimate this felt, alone in her chambers, moonlight streaming through windows, his careful concern wrapping around her like warmth. I've assigned Luther permanently to your protection, Alistair continued. He'll shadow you everywhere. I know you value your privacy, but... I understand, Alara interrupted softly. Thank you. He moved closer, and she could see the strain in his face, the fear he was trying to control. I cannot lose you, he said, and the rawness in his voice made her heart stutter. My son cannot lose you. The progress we've made, the peace he's finally found. This isn't just about your son, is it? The words escaped before she could stop them. Alistair froze, and something vulnerable flickered across his perfect features. No, he admitted after a long moment. It isn't. The air between them felt charged, electric. Alara's breath caught as he took another step closer, close enough now that she could see the faint shadows beneath his eyes, still present despite the better sleep he'd been getting. You've given my son back his childhood, Alistair said quietly. But you've also given me something I thought I'd lost forever when my wife died. What's that? Alara whispered. Hope. His hand lifted, hovering near her face, as if he wanted to touch her, but didn't dare. The belief that perhaps there's still light to be found in all this darkness. Alara's heart thundered. She was falling for him. Not the vampire king, but the man beneath the crown. The father who read bedtime stories with voices for each character. The lonely soul who'd built walls to protect himself from grief and was only now learning to let them crumble. The court wants me gone, she said, needing him to understand the reality. Staying here puts everyone at risk. Then they'll have to accept that risk, Alistair said firmly, his voice taking on the command of a king. Because you're not leaving. Not unless you choose to. And he stopped, conflict warring in his expression. I very much hope you don't choose to. Before Alara could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them. Luther entered without waiting for permission, his expression urgent. Your Majesty, we've intercepted correspondence. The Crimson Veil is moving faster than anticipated. His eyes flicked to Alara. They're planning something within the week. Alistair's face became stone. Double the watch rotations. Lock down the royal wing. No one enters without my explicit permission. Already done, sire. As Luther left, Alistair turned back to Alara, and she saw something in his eyes that both thrilled and terrified her. I won't let them hurt you, he said, and it sounded like both a promise and a declaration of something deeper. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, I will keep you safe. The wards began flickering on the third day. Alara noticed it first during breakfast, a shimmer in the air like heat rising from stone, there and gone in a heartbeat. She mentioned it to Luther, who stood sentinel by the nursery door as always. His expression darkened. The protection barriers. Someone's testing them. By evening, the flickering had increased. Alara could see it now without trying, ripples of translucent energy pulsing across windows and doorways, struggling to maintain cohesion. Guards moved through corridors with hands on weapons, their supernatural senses clearly detecting something wrong. Stay in the royal wing tonight, Corvin ordered, his scarred face grim. Don't leave for any reason. What's happening? Alara asked, though dread already provided the answer. They're coming. The fog arrived after midnight. Alara stood at her chamber window, the prince sleeping peacefully in the nursery beyond, and watched tendrils of unnatural mist creep across the fortress grounds. It moved wrong, against the wind, seeking rather than drifting, pressing against walls like something alive and hungry. She tried to sleep but couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was building just beyond sight. Now, watching that crimson-tinged fog curl around towers and seep through gates, she knew her instincts had been right. A ward shattered somewhere in the east wing, a sound like breaking glass magnified 1,000 times. Then another, and another. Suddenly, the fortress erupted. Alarm screamed through stone corridors, a wailing that made Alara's bones ache. Shouts echoed from every direction, followed by the unmistakable clash of steel on steel. She heard Corvin's battle cry from somewhere below, Maro's shouted commands, the thunder of armored feet racing toward conflict. Alara ran for the nursery. The prince stood in his crib, eyes wide with terror, small hands gripping the rails. He saw her and immediately reached out, whimpering. "It's okay, sweetheart." Alara scooped him up, her heart hammering. "I've got you. I've got." Luther burst through the main door, sword drawn, blood spattering his armor. They've breached the inner halls. Assassins heading this way, multiple targets moving fast. He positioned himself between Alara and the entrance. "Get behind me, now." Alara backed toward the far wall, clutching the prince close, humming desperately to keep him calm, even as her own fear threatened to choke her. The boy buried his face against her shoulder, his small body trembling. The sounds of battle grew closer. She heard Maro's voice roaring in the corridor. "Hold this position. Don't let them through." Then came a sound that froze her blood, Luther's grunt of pain, the clatter of his sword hitting stone. Two figures in black materialized from the shadows near the connecting door to Alistair's chambers, assassins who'd bypassed the main defense, their faces hidden behind dark masks, blades gleaming with something that looked disturbingly like poison. The prince, one hissed in a vampiric tongue. "Take the prince." Luther threw himself at them despite his wound, buying seconds. But a third assassin appeared from the corridor, slipping past the warrior's desperate defense, moving with inhuman speed directly toward Alara and the child. Time seemed to fracture. Alara saw the blade rising, saw the assassin's crimson eyes locked on the prince and her arms with murderous intent. She had no weapon, no training, no supernatural strength. She had only instinct. No! She turned her body, wrapping herself completely around the prince, making herself the only target. She felt him clutch her desperately and heard his terrified whimper against her chest. The blade came down. Pain erupted across her shoulders, white-hot and absolute, as steel found flesh. And then the world exploded in crimson light. The prince screamed, not in fear now, but with a sound that seemed to tear reality itself. Power erupted from his small body in a shockwave of red energy that lit the nursery like captured lightning. Alara felt it surge through her, around her, from the child pressed against her heart. The assassin flew backward, slamming into the wall with bone-breaking force. Windows shattered outward, furniture splintered. The very stones of the walls cracked as ancient magic, dormant since birth, finally awakened in desperate defense of the one person who'd shown the prince unconditional love. The remaining assassins fled, wounded and terrified, abandoning their mission in the face of power they'd never anticipated. The red light pulsed once more, then faded. Alara collapsed, the prince still clutched to her chest, blood blooming across her back. The pain was distant now, cushioned by shock. She could hear the child crying, feel his tears on her neck, but couldn't seem to make her body respond. Alara. Luther crawled toward them, face pale, pressing his hand desperately against her wound. "Stay with me. Stay." "The prince," she managed to whisper. "Is he unharmed? You protected him." Luther's voice cracked. "You threw yourself over him. You." More footsteps thundered into the room. Corvin and Maro, weapons drawn, taking in the destroyed nursery, the fleeing assassins, the blood. And then Alistair. The vampire king appeared in the doorway like death incarnate, crown askew, armor splattered with enemy blood, his crimson eyes wild with fear Alara had never seen in him. He took in the scene in a single glance, his son crying but alive, Alara on the floor bleeding, the evidence of catastrophic power release scorched into the walls. He crossed the room faster than her eyes could track, dropping to his knees beside her with such force the floor cracked.
No.
No, no, no. His hands hovered over her wound, trembling, the first time she'd ever seen him uncertain. Alara, stay awake. Look at me.
She tried.
God, she tried. But her vision was darkening at the edges, and she felt so cold despite the blood that seemed to be everywhere. The prince, she whispered again, because nothing else mattered. He's safe. Because of you. Alistair's voice broke as he carefully gathered both her and his son into his arms. The boy clung to them both, his cries finally quieting to hiccuping sobs. You saved him. You threw yourself between him and death without hesitation. Of course, Alara managed, confused why he'd think she'd do anything else. He's just a baby. Something in Alistair's expression shattered. He looked at her with such raw emotion, fear, gratitude, grief, something deeper she couldn't name, that it took her breath away. Healers, he roared, his voice carrying the absolute command of a king who would watch his kingdom burn before he lost what he held. Now, Alara felt herself being lifted, felt the prince's small hand still tangled in her hair, heard Alistair's voice close to her ear. Stay with me.
Please.
Stay with me. She wanted to promise him she would, but darkness was rising like a tide, pulling her under despite every attempt to fight it. The last thing she registered was the prince's heartbeat against her chest, steady and strong, and Alistair's voice breaking as he repeated the same desperate plea. Don't leave us.
Please.
Don't leave us. Then there was nothing but shadow and silence, and the distant sound of something like destiny reshaping itself in her wake. Pain woke her, not the sharp agony of the blade that had faded to a distant memory, but a deep, aching throb that spread across her shoulders and down her spine. Alara's eyes fluttered open to unfamiliar surroundings bathed in soft candlelight. This wasn't her chamber. The room was larger, more opulent, midnight blue silk curtains, furniture carved from dark wood and inlaid with silver, a ceiling painted with constellations that seemed to actually move. The bed she lay in was massive, the sheets softer than anything she'd ever felt. And in a chair pulled close to the bedside, still wearing battle-stained armor, crown discarded on the nearby table, sat Alistair Varen. He looked like he'd aged a century. His silver hair hung loose around his face, his crimson eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, so profound it seemed carved into his bones. His hands gripped the chair arms with white-knuckled intensity, and she realized with a start that he was trembling. Your Majesty. Her voice came out hoarse, broken. His eyes snapped to hers, and the relief that flooded his face was so raw it hurt to witness. You're awake. He leaned forward, one hand reaching toward her before stopping, hovering in the air as if afraid touching her might shatter something fragile. The healers said you would wake, but his voice cracked. How long have I been? 36 hours, Alistair said quietly. You've been unconscious for 36 hours. The blade was poisoned, something designed to incapacitate vampires. For a human, it should have been fatal.
His jaw tightened.
But you fought it. Even while unconscious, you fought. Alara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through her shoulders. Don't. Alistair was suddenly beside her on the bed, his hands gentle but firm as he helped adjust the pillows behind her. This close, she could see the fine tremor in his fingers, could smell blood and smoke still clinging to his armor. You took a blade meant to kill my son. Your body needs time to heal. The prince, she said immediately, panic cutting through the fog of pain. Is he safe, unharmed, sleeping in the nursery under guard by Corvin himself? Alistair's voice softened. He's been asking for you. Every hour, he asks when you'll wake, when you'll sing to him again. Tears pricked Alara's eyes. I need to see him. You will.
Soon.
Alistair settled back slightly, though he remained close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his undead body. But first you need to heal. And he stopped, his perfect composure finally cracking. I need to say something. Things I should have said before assassins broke into my home and nearly took everything from me. Alara waited, her heart hammering despite the exhaustion weighing her down. Alistair was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands as if he'd never seen them before. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Her name was Isadora. Alara's breath caught. He'd never spoken his wife's name aloud in her presence. She was a vampire duchess from the Northern Territories, beautiful, intelligent, fierce. A political match that became something more. His hands clenched. She got pregnant within the first year. Everyone celebrated. An heir to secure the Varen line, to cement alliances, to ensure the kingdom's future. He paused, and Alara saw his throat work as he swallowed. The birth was difficult. The healers warned us there were complications, something about her bloodline mixing with mine, creating instability. They said she might not survive. His voice dropped to something jagged. I told them to save her, that the kingdom could wait for an heir, but I couldn't lose her. What happened? Alara asked softly. She made them promise to save the child instead. Alistair's eyes glistened with unshed tears that looked like liquid rubies in the candlelight. She died giving the order. Died before she ever held our son. Before she could see his eyes or hear his first cry. His voice broke completely. She bled out in my arms while I was powerless to stop it, and all I could do was watch her slip away while our son screamed in the background. Alistair. I failed her, he continued, the words pouring out now like poison lanced from a wound. I'm the most powerful being in the Dominion, and I couldn't protect my own wife. Couldn't save her. Couldn't even give her those final moments with the child she died to bring into this world. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window, his shoulders rigid with barely contained emotion. So I built walls. Around myself, around my son. I told myself it was protection, that if we never got too close to anyone, never let ourselves love too deeply, we couldn't be destroyed by loss again. His laugh was bitter. I turned my son into a prince before he could be a child, surrounded him with respect instead of warmth. And I told myself I was keeping him safe. But you were suffocating him, Alara said quietly. I was killing him, Alistair corrected, turning to face her. His mask was gone completely now, leaving only a man carved hollow by grief and guilt. He was dying slowly, from the inside out, and I was so terrified of losing him the way I lost Isadora that I couldn't see I was causing the very suffering I feared. He moved back to the bedside, dropping to his knees beside her, a king kneeling before a waitress, all pretense of authority stripped away. Then you appeared, he said, his voice raw. You looked at my son and saw not a prince or an heir or a political asset, but simply a child who needed comfort. You didn't hesitate, didn't calculate risks. You just cared. Alara felt tears slip down her cheeks. And it terrified me, Alistair continued, because watching my son fall in love with you meant watching him become vulnerable again. Watching him depend on someone I couldn't control, couldn't protect, couldn't guarantee wouldn't leave or die or be torn away. His hands fisted in the bed covers. I knew I should send you away, knowing that every day you stayed made the inevitable loss worse. Then why didn't you? Alara whispered. Alistair looked up at her, and the emotion in his eyes nearly stopped her heart. Because somewhere between watching you rock my son to sleep and seeing you laugh at his childish games, between your gentle defiance of my protocols and your absolute fearlessness in defending him, he paused, his voice dropping to something achingly tender. I realized I was falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irrevocable. When I saw you on that floor, bleeding, my son crying in your arms, Alistair's voice shattered. I understood for the first time what Isadora must have felt. That desperate, consuming need to protect something more precious than your own life. that willingness to burn the world down if it meant keeping them safe. He reached up slowly, his hand trembling as it cupped her face with infinite gentleness. "You make my son feel safe," he whispered. "You gave him back his childhood, his laughter, his peace." But Alara, his thumb brushed away her tears. "You make me feel hope. For the first time since Isadora died, I can imagine a future that isn't just shadow and duty. I can imagine joy, warmth, love." "I'm just a waitress," Alara said, her voice breaking. "I have no power, no wealth, no right to." "You have everything that matters," Alistair interrupted fiercely. "You have courage that shames warriors, compassion that humbles healers, and a heart big enough to love a broken man and his grieving son without asking for anything in return." He leaned forward until his forehead rested gently against hers, his eyes closing as if in prayer. "I can't promise this will be easy. The kingdom will fight us. The prophecy will haunt us. Danger will always lurk at the edges." His eyes opened, holding hers with devastating intensity. "But I swear on everything I am, I will protect you. I will honor you. And I will spend whatever time we have proving that you are the greatest gift fate ever gave me." Alara's breath caught as she finally saw him completely. Not the vampire king, not the feared ruler, but simply a man who'd lost everything and was terrified to hope again. A father who'd learned to love through her eyes. A soul that had been frozen for so long it had forgotten warmth existed. "I'm afraid," she admitted in a whisper. "So am I," Alistair said. "But I'm more afraid of a life without you in it." The council convened 3 days later, and their verdict was unanimous. Alara stood outside the throne room with Luther, still healing but strong enough to walk. Through the heavy doors, she could hear Lady Seraphine's voice rising in pitch. "The assassination attempt proves what we've been saying for weeks. The human is a target, a vulnerability we cannot afford. For her own safety and the kingdom's stability, she must be removed from the Dominion immediately." Seconded. Commander Valen's voice followed. "We've tripled guard rotations, but another attack is inevitable. The Crimson Veil won't stop until they've eliminated what they perceive as a threat to their vision of the prince's future." Alara's hands clenched. She'd known this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. "She nearly died protecting the air." Corvin's gruff voice cut through. "That should count for something." "It counts for everything," Alistair said, his tone cold as winter. "Which is precisely why this council will not dictate her fate." "Your Majesty," Lady Seraphine pressed, "we're thinking of the girl's well-being. She's in constant danger here." "Then we increase security. We cannot protect her indefinitely. The Crimson Veil has resources, connections, patience. They will try again, and next time, they will face the full might of the Eclipse Dominion," Alistair interrupted, his voice carrying absolute authority. "I will not exile someone who sacrificed herself for my son simply because protecting her requires effort." The doors opened, and a pale-faced attendant gestured for Alara to enter. Luther moved to follow, but she shook her head. "I need to do this alone." The throne room fell silent as she walked down the center aisle. Dozens of vampires, nobles, advisors, military commanders watched her with expressions ranging from hostility to pity. At the far end, Alistair sat upon his obsidian throne, crown gleaming, looking every inch the feared ruler. But she saw past it now, saw the man beneath the crown, the father behind the king. "Miss Quinn," Lady Seraphine said with forced politeness, "we've been discussing your situation. Given the recent incident, we believe it's in everyone's best interest if you return to your former life. Compensation will be provided, of course. Enough to ensure comfort for you and your grandmother." "You're trying to pay me to leave," Alara said quietly. "We're trying to save your life," Commander Valen corrected. "The attacks will continue. You may not survive the next one." Alara looked at Alistair. He sat rigid, conflict clear in every line of his body. She could see him wrestling with the same terrible choice: keep her close and risk her death, or send her away and watch his son's heart break. She made the decision for both of them. "I'm staying," Alara said clearly. The room erupted in whispers. Miss Quinn, Lady Seraphine began, you don't understand the danger. I understand perfectly. Alara turned to face the council, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. I understand there are people who want me dead. I understand staying here means living with that threat every day. I understand that loving someone in this world, her eyes found Alistair's, comes with risks that could cost everything. She paused, letting her words settle. But I also understand that the little boy upstairs finally sleeps through the night. That he laughs now. That he's learning what it means to be loved unconditionally. Her voice strengthened. And I understand that if I leave, I'll be abandoning someone who needs me. Someone I love. Two someones, actually. Alistair's breath caught audibly. So yes, I'm staying, Alara continued. Not because I'm brave, and not because I'm foolish, but because some things are worth the risk. And that child, that family, is worth everything. The silence that followed was absolute. Finally, Alistair rose from his throne. He descended the steps slowly, deliberately, until he stood before her. Then, in front of the entire court, the Vampire King took her hand and pressed it to his lips. Then it's decided, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Miss Quinn stays. Anyone who has objections can direct them to me personally. No one spoke. The meeting adjourned. Alistair declared. The following weeks transformed everything. Corvin took over Alara's training personally, meeting her in the courtyard each dawn. I can't make you a warrior in a few weeks, he said gruffly, handing her a practice blade. But I can teach you to survive long enough for help to arrive. The first time she successfully blocked his strike, his scarred face split in an approving grin.
Good.
Again. Morrow taught her palace protocol, which nobles could be trusted, which corridors were safe, the subtle hierarchies that govern the vampire court. Lady Seraphine will never like you, he said frankly. But she respects strength. Stand your ground, and she'll eventually yield. Luther became something unexpected, protective in the way of an older brother. He showed her hidden passages through the fortress, taught her which guards were truly loyal, and once, after she'd had a particularly difficult day dealing with hostile nobles, left a small bouquet of night-blooming flowers outside her door with no note. When she thanked him, he'd simply shrugged. You threw yourself over the prince. That makes you a family. Slowly, impossibly, the palace began to shift around her. Guards who'd once glared started nodding respectfully when she passed. Servants began greeting her by name. Even some of the younger nobles started approaching her with cautious curiosity rather than outright hostility. She disarmed them with simple kindness, remembering names, asking about their families, treating everyone from the highest lord to the lowest servant with equal respect. It was so foreign to the rigid hierarchy, they knew that it became revolutionary. You're changing things, Alistair told her one evening as they watched the prince play with building blocks in the nursery. The court is actually softening. They're just people, Alara said. Most of them, anyway. They were scared of change. Now they're seeing that it might not be so terrible. The prince knocked over his tower and giggled, a sound of pure joy that made them both freeze. Did he just, Alara began. Laugh, Alistair whispered, wondering in his voice. He laughed. The prince looked up at them, eyes bright, and laughed again, bubbling, infectious, the most beautiful sound either of them had ever heard. Alistair sank to his knees beside his son, gathering the boy into his arms. The prince wrapped small arms around his father's neck and giggled directly into his ear. Alistair's shoulders shook, and Alara realized he was crying, silent tears streaming down his perfect face as he held his son and heard true happiness for the first time. Thank you, he whispered over the prince's head, looking at Alara with such profound gratitude it made her chest ache. Thank you for giving him this. I've been thinking about what you said, about choosing to stay despite the danger. Having second thoughts about letting me? Alara asked lightly.
No.
He turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes stole her breath. I'm thinking about how you chose us.
Choose this life.
Choose darkness and danger and uncertainty because you believed we were worth it. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, His hand cupped her face with devastating gentleness. "I want to choose you back," he whispered. "Not as a king claiming what he wants, but as a man asking permission to love you the way you deserve." Alara's heart thundered. "Alistair, I know it's complicated. I know there are 1,000 reasons this is impossible. I know." She stopped his words by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, tentative, profound. Alistair froze for a heartbeat before responding, his arms coming around her carefully as if she were something precious and breakable. He tasted of night and possibility, and when they finally parted, both of them were trembling. "I choose you too," Alara whispered against his lips. "I choose all of this. The danger, the politics, the impossible situation. Because I choose love." Alistair rested his forehead against hers, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled, not a king's calculated expression, but genuine joy. "Then we'll face whatever comes," he said. "Together." 3 weeks after the assassination attempt, Lady Seraphine called for an emergency council session. Alara wasn't supposed to attend, but Corvin came to her chambers at dawn with a grim expression. "They're making their final move. You should be there." The throne room was packed when she arrived, not just the usual advisors, but nobles from across the Dominion, military commanders, representatives from allied territories. This wasn't a council meeting. This was a trial. Lady Seraphine stood at the center, her elaborate robes sweeping the floor as she addressed the assembled court. "For weeks, we've watched this kingdom fracture over the presence of a single human. Factions have formed. Ancient protocols have been abandoned. The crimson veil grows bolder, emboldened by the chaos." "Get to your point, Seraphine," Commander Valen said impatiently. "My point." She turned to face the throne where Alistair sat, crown gleaming, expression unreadable, "is that we can no longer afford division. The human has served her purpose." She calmed the prince, and for that we're grateful. "But it's time for her to return to her world before her presence destroys ours." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. "We propose a formal vote." Lord Kieran, an ancient vampire from the Eastern Territories, stepped forward. "All those in favor of Miss Quinn's exile, for her protection and our stability, signify now." Hands rose throughout the room. Not all, but enough to create a clear majority. Alara's stomach twisted. She caught Corvin's eye. He stood with his arms crossed, hand conspicuously not raised. Morrow and Luther flanked the throne, their expressions thunderous. "The council has spoken," Lady Seraphine said with poorly concealed satisfaction. "Your Majesty, we await your decree." Alistair said nothing. He simply stared at the assembled nobles with an expression so cold several took involuntary steps backward. Then he stood. But instead of approaching the council, he turned and walked through the private entrance behind the throne. Confused whispers erupted. Alara's heart was hammered. What was he? The doors opened again. Alistair Varen, vampire king of the Eclipse Dominion, entered carrying his son in his arms. The prince wore formal attire, a miniature version of his father's ceremonial dress, but his small arms were wrapped trustingly around Alistair's neck, his face peaceful. As they descended the steps, the boy looked out at the assembled court with those remarkable crimson eyes, and absolute silence fell. Alistair stopped at the center of the hall, still holding his son, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner. 4 months ago, this child screamed every waking moment. He knew no peace, no comfort, no joy. He paused, letting them absorb this. Dozens of healers tried to help him. Mages searched for curses. Night nurses trained in ancient arts attempted every remedy known to our kind. All failed. The prince made a contented sound and rested his head on his father's shoulder, completely at ease. Then a human waitress touched his cheek. Alistair continued, and he fell silent for the first time since his birth. She looked at him and saw not a prince or a prophecy, but simply a child who needed love. He turned slowly, addressing the entire court. "She gave my son his childhood back, taught him to laugh, showed him that the world could hold warmth as well as shadow." His voice strengthened. "And she did this knowing it would make her a target, knowing nobles would despise her. knowing assassins would hunt her. Lady Seraphine shifted uncomfortably. She threw herself over my son when blades fell. Alistair's voice turned sharp as ice. Took poison meant for him into her own body. Nearly died protecting an heir she had no obligation to defend. He looked directly at those who'd voted for exile. And now you want to reward that sacrifice by sending her away? By telling her she's served her purpose and is no longer wanted. Your Majesty, Lord Kieran spoke carefully. We mean no disrespect, but the political reality. The political reality, Alistair interrupted, his voice carrying absolute authority, is about to change. He shifted his son in his arms and crossed the hall to where Alara stood. The crowd parted instinctively. When he reached her, he did something that sent shock rippling through the assembled nobles. The vampire king knelt. Gasps echoed through the throne room. Several vampires looked genuinely horrified. Kings did not kneel, not even to other monarchs, and certainly never to humans. But Alistair kept his eyes on Alara's face, his son still held securely in one arm, and reached into his coat with the other. He withdrew a ring, not gold or silver, but a dark metal she didn't recognize, set with a stone that seemed to hold captured starlight. This is a blood oath ring, Alistair said, his voice quiet but carrying nonetheless. For 1,000 years, it has been given only to eternal partners, those bound not by politics or duty, but by choice, by love, by commitment that transcends death itself. The prince reached for Alara, making small sounds of recognition. She automatically moved closer, and the boy transferred himself to her arms, clinging to her with complete trust while his father remained kneeling. Alara Quinn, Alistair said, and she heard emotion trembling beneath the formal words. You have given my son the family he deserves. You have reminded me what it means to hope. You have chosen darkness and danger and an impossible situation because you believed we were worth saving. He held out the ring. I am asking you to be more than the woman who saved my son. I am asking you to be my partner, my equal, the heart of this family, and the light of this kingdom. His voice dropped to something achingly vulnerable. I am asking you to marry me, knowing it will defy tradition, enrage nobles, and reshape everything this dominion has been. The silence was absolute. Every eye in the throne room was fixed on them. Alara looked at the ring, then at Alistair's upturned face, at the vulnerability and hope warring in his expression. She looked at the prince in her arms, who'd wrapped his small hands in her hair and was watching her with those two knowing eyes. She thought about her grandmother's medical bills waiting in a drawer, about the life she'd left behind, about every logical reason she should refuse this impossible offer. Then she thought about the way the prince laughed now, the way Alistair smiled when he read bedtime stories, the way this broken family had somehow become whole through their shared healing. Yes, she said clearly. The word fell like a thunderclap. Alistair's breath caught. He slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, and the moment the metal touched her skin, it warmed and seemed to glow with inner light. She felt something settle around her heart, not invasive, but protective, binding. Alistair stood slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, and cupped her face with infinite gentleness. I vow to protect you, to honor you,